The courtyard smelled faintly of wood smoke and boiled lentils, though the air was heavy with something sharper, envy. Lala, barely 20, knelt by the grinding stone, her slender hands powdered with grain. Her dark hair fell loosely across her shoulders, and even dressed in coarse linen, she carried an effortless grace that drew eyes wherever she went. But here in her aunt's household that grace was a curse. From the kitchen doorway her cousins watched with narrowed eyes. "She thinks herself finer than us," one whispered, her lips curling with bitterness. "Look how she shines even in rags." Their mother, Lala's aunt, stepped into the courtyard, her heavy bracelets clinking. She had grown tired of whispers in the village, of people comparing her daughters to the orphan girls she begrudgingly sheltered. Every word of admiration for Lala felt like a thorn in her side. "Stop your idling," she barked, her eyes on Lala. "Grind faster. Do you expect us to starve while you dream?" "Yes, aunt," Lala replied softly, lowering her eyes. Her voice carried no defiance, only quiet obedience, but the aunt heard mockery in every gentle tone. That night, after the lamps were lit and shadows danced on the walls, the bitterness in the household boiled over. The cousins had returned from the village well, where once again they had heard women whisper, "Lala has her father's eyes, Lala has her mother's grace." Rage clung to them like smoke. In the kitchen, a pot of oil simmered, its surface trembling with heat. One cousin whispered to the other, "If beauty is her crown, let us strip it away. Let her learn what it means to be despised." Their mother said nothing to stop them. Her silence was permission enough. Lala entered carrying a jug of water, her face calm despite the day's labor. She never saw the hand that reached for the pot, never saw the flash of oil until it was too late. The scalding liquid splashed across her cheek, searing skin in an instant. She cried out, dropping the jug as it shattered, water spreading across the floor. Her hands flew to her face, but the pain was already roaring through her like fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The cousins stepped back, startled by the rawness of what they had done, but their aunt's cold gaze held steady. "So be it," she muttered. "Now the village will have no more to say." Lala writhed on the floor, her tears mingling with the water, her cries echoing through the courtyard. Servants peeked from corners but dared not intervene. By morning the wound had cooled but the mark remained, a scar running down her once smooth cheek, angry and red, a wound that no herb or poultice could erase. Word spread quickly. At the well, women whispered, hands pressed to their mouths. Men shook their heads in pity, some even in scorn. "What beauty she had is gone," they murmured. "What man would look at her now?" Children, too young to understand cruelty, pointed and laughed as she passed. Lala carried her shame in silence. She lowered her head, let her hair fall across her face, and walked quickly through the village streets. Yet the scar could not be hidden. It was a brand, a punishment she had not earned, marking her as less than what she had been. Her aunt's household grew colder still. "Cover yourself," the woman would sneer. "Your face frightens even the chickens." Her cousins smirked, delighted that their rival's beauty had been stolen. They gave her the dirtiest tasks, scrubbing, fetching, tending fires, knowing she would not protest. But when night fell, alone beneath the stars, Lala pressed her hand gently to her scar and wept. It was not only the pain of her wound, but the cruelty behind it, the deliberate attempt to destroy her. She prayed to the memory of her father, the kind healer who had once called her his little star. "Father," she whispered into the darkness, "if there is truth in what you taught me, if kindness matters, let this scar not be the end of me." The heavens offered no answer, only silence. Yet somewhere deep inside, beyond the ache and the shame, a seed of resilience stirred. She did not know it yet, but the scar that had been meant to erase her would one day become the mark that revealed her destiny. Long before the scar, before the whispers of pity and scorn, Lala had lived in a different world. Her earliest memories were of her father's gentle voice, the sound of herbs being crushed in a stone mortar, and the warm glow of lamps in their family courtyard. Her father, Ghanian, had been a healer respected in every corner of the valley. When fever swept through the village, he was the one who went from house to house, carrying his satchel of dried roots and powders. When children fell and scraped their knees, he bound their wounds with soft hands and words that soothed more than the salves he applied. And always at his side was little Lala, eager eyes wide with curiosity. "Why does willow bark ease pain?" she would ask, holding up a piece of stripped wood. "Because it remembers how to carry water," her father would reply with a smile. "And so it carries away fever as well." To the villagers, Ghanian was more than a healer. He was a man of compassion, one who never refused help to the poor, who asked for no more than a loaf of bread when families could not pay. And to Lala he was the whole world. Her mother had died when she was very small, leaving the two of them to make their home together. She did not miss her mother's love, for her father gave her enough of both parents' devotion. But kindness, in a world tainted by greed, can sometimes plant envy in dark hearts. When Daryen fell ill one winter night, the village was stunned. He had returned from tending a patient and collapsed before the hearth. Lala had tried to help him sit, her small hands trembling as she held a cup to his lips. He whispered her name, tried to smile, then coughed until blood touched his lips. By dawn he was gone. The village mourned, but none more than the girl left behind. Lala, barely 13, stood beside his shrouded form with tears that would not stop. She clutched his satchel of herbs as though it might anchor his presence. The neighbors whispered their sorrow, some offering bread, some bringing cloth. But in the days that followed, sorrow gave way to gossip. Who would take the orphan girl? It was her father's sister, Parvana, who stepped forward. She was not a poor woman. She had a fine house, servants, and daughters of her own. "I will take her," she said, her face solemn. "She is blood after all." At first, Lala believed she might still know warmth in this new household. Her cousins, though older, smiled sweetly when she arrived. Her aunt gave her a place to sleep, a space in the kitchen, and said, "You are safe now." But the sweetness was short-lived. Within weeks, Parvana's words shifted from comfort to command. "Sweep that floor. Carry water. You are young, you can fetch faster." At first Lala obeyed gladly, eager to show gratitude. But she noticed her cousins did not labor as she did. They spent their mornings weaving or embroidering, their afternoons walking proudly in the market, while Lala's hands grew raw from scrubbing. Over time, the whispers reached her ears. "She is prettier than my girls," Parvana muttered one evening, her eyes sharp as she watched Lala bend over a fire. "And she knows too much of herbs. Already the neighbors call her Daryen's daughter, as if she carries his gift. I will not have my own children overshadowed." That was when her meals grew smaller, the warm blankets fewer, the work harsher. If bread was scarce, Lala ate crusts. If mats were few, she slept in the cold corner near the storage jars. Each day that passed, she was reminded, gently at first, then cruelly, that she was a guest only by name. By 15 she was no longer spoken of as family. She was simply the orphan. Her cousins called her ash-stained, and laughed when she carried heavy baskets on her back. The servants, fearful of angering their mistress, turned their eyes away when she stumbled under the weight. Yet Lala bore it with quiet dignity. Her father's voice lived in her memory, "Kindness is never wasted, my little star. Even if the world gives cruelty in return, let not your heart be poisoned." But in her aunt's heart, poison had already taken root. Parvana watched her niece grow from a thin child into a young woman, her features sharpening into beauty that could not be hidden by rags. Lala's eyes, dark, luminous, filled with a gentle light, reminded everyone of her late father. Even the villagers who pitied her spoke kindly of her grace. And with every word of admiration, Parvana's jealousy deepened. It was whispered among the older women that Daryen's death had been sudden, too sudden for a healer of his skill. Some murmured that a hand in his own house may have hastened it. Lala herself never dared to suspect such a thing, her heart too innocent, her grief too raw. But in the stillness of night, when Parvana's eyes glittered like coals, when her words dripped venom without cause, a small seed of doubt sometimes stirred in Lala's mind. Years passed and Lala's misery became ordinary. She rose before dawn, worked until her bones ached, and endured her cousin's laughter. She learned to silence her hunger, to soothe herself with memories of her father's songs. And though she still held his satchel of herbs close, she was never permitted to use it. Parvana kept it locked away, muttering that a girl like Lala had no right to touch such knowledge. Yet even as cruelty pressed her down, it could not crush what was within her. In her heart, there remained a spark, of kindness, of resilience, of her father's legacy. It was this spark that made her aunt tremble in secret. For Parvana feared not just Lala's beauty, but something more dangerous, her unbreakable spirit. The days after the burning stretched into years, and the scar never softened. It ran down Lala's cheek like a river of flame frozen in her skin. No ointment healed it, no cloth covered it well enough. It had become her name as much as her face. At the village well, where women gathered with jars balanced on their hips, Lala felt the sting of stares as keenly as the scar itself. When she bent to draw water, whispers slid between the clinking of pots. "There she is, the scarred one. She was beautiful once. Such a pity. Perhaps the mark is punishment for hidden sins." Lala heard it all, though she never raised her eyes. She simply tied the rope around her jar and lifted, arms trembling not from weakness but from the weight of humiliation pressing down. Children, too innocent to mask their cruelty, pointed and laughed. "Monster face," one shouted, running circles around her. She knelt, steadying the jar so it would not spill, and said nothing. Her silence only gave them more courage to jeer. When festivals lit the village with lanterns and laughter, her cousins wrapped themselves in silk and kohl. Lala remained behind, scrubbing floors until her hands were raw. Once, she dared to glance at her reflection in the water jar, her scar shining stark in the lamplight, and she understood why her aunt never let her walk in the procession. Beauty was currency, and in her house she had none left to spend. Yet cruelty did not hollow her completely. Even as she bore shame, her heart leaned toward kindness. If a child scraped a knee, she knelt to clean the wound. If an old man coughed through the night, she left herbs at his doorstep, remnants of what her father had once taught her. She never claimed credit. It was enough that someone's pain was eased. There were nights when she lay awake, the cold seeping through the thin mat beneath her, and her fingers traced the scar as if it were a map to a place she could not yet see. She wondered if her life would ever be more than this shadow, if the cruelty she bore was all the world would give her. Still, when morning came, she rose, lit the hearth, and began again. Her aunt and cousins mistook her quiet strength for defeat. They laughed louder when she passed, demanded harsher work, tossed her scraps instead of meals. But in Lala's silence lived something they could not name, something that unsettled them, a dignity that no scar could erase. And so, though the world tried to brand her as broken, she remained whole in the one place no flame could touch, her spirit. Spring came with trumpets. One morning the air over the valley rang with the pounding of hooves. Villagers looked up from their fields and doorways as royal messengers rode through the dusty streets, banners snapping in the wind. Their voices carried like thunder. By decree of His Majesty the King, on the 7th night of the new moon, all households shall gather at the royal city. A great assembly shall be held. From every home, one shall be chosen to present themselves before the court. The villagers pressed forward, eyes wide. Such decrees were rare. For what purpose? Someone shouted. The messenger's horse reared, and the man lifted a scroll. The king seeks healers, wise folk, and those of noble spirit to serve in the palace. All shall be tested. Let no house be absent, or be counted in dishonor. The crowd erupted in chatter. Healers? Wise folk? Does he seek to fill his court with sages? No one knew for certain, but the thrill was undeniable. In her aunt's house, the news was met with sharp silence. Parvana's lips thinned as she listened. Her daughters squealed with excitement, already imagining themselves in jeweled gowns beneath golden chandeliers. But as she glanced at Lala, bent over the hearth with ashes smudged across her scar, a cruel idea began to form. That night she gathered her daughters. "The king has commanded that each house must send one," she said, her voice low. "We must decide carefully who it will be." Her eldest pouted. "It should be me. I have the finest voice." "No," said the younger, adjusting her bracelets. "I will go. My hair is long, my eyes are bright. The king will choose me." But their mother shook her head, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face. "Neither of you. I have something better in mind." The sisters blinked in confusion. Then, as their mother's gaze shifted to the corner where Lala knelt, realization dawned, and laughter spilled from their lips. "You cannot mean." "Oh, but it would be perfect. She will shame herself before the king. And us? We will shine all the brighter." Lala lifted her head, startled. "Aunt, you mean to send me?" Parvana's eyes glittered. "Every house must send one. And in ours it shall be you. You will go to the king's assembly. You will wear what you have, nothing more. And take this." She rummaged through a chest and pulled out a plate. It was not gold or silver, not even polished copper, but a dented tin dish, its edge cracked. She thrust it into Lala's hands. "Every family must bring their plate to the feast. This is yours. Carry it proudly." The cousins howled with laughter. A cracked plate for a scarred girl. "The king will send her out before the court like a beggar. Let her be our humiliation, so we may rise higher." Lala lowered her eyes, clutching the broken plate to her chest. The heat of shame flushed through her. She could not refuse. The decree demanded one from every house, and she was powerless to resist her aunt's command. The days before the journey were filled with cruel delight for her cousins. They spun silk for themselves, embroidered new scarves, powdered their faces with crushed chalk. At every stitch they whispered mockery in Lala's ear. Do not hide your scar, perhaps the king will fancy monsters. On the final day the road to the capital swelled with people. Families walked in clusters bearing baskets wearing their best. Some carried plates of gold, others silver, some inlaid with gems. Laughter and song filled the air as the crowd surged toward the city gates. Among them walked Lale barefoot, her steps quiet. The cracked plate pressed against her chest, her tattered clothes hanging loose around her thin frame. The scar on her face caught the sunlight and heads turned, not in admiration but in pity and ridicule. She dares to come, someone whispered. With a face like that? Look at her plate, fit only for scraps. But Lala said nothing. She walked with her eyes lowered, though inside her heart churned with fear and shame. Still, a fragment of her father's voice stirred within her memory. Do not despise what is small or broken, little star. Sometimes the humble vessel carries the purest water. She held to those words as the palace gates loomed ahead, towers rising like mountains of stone, banners streaming in the wind. Inside, destiny waited, and though she did not yet know it, the cracked plate she carried would one day change everything. The capital glimmered like a dream as the villagers approached its gates. Towers of pale stone rose into the sky, their peaks crowned with fluttering banners. Sunlight poured over gilded roofs, and the air itself seemed richer, scented with saffron, rosewater, and roasting meats from the palace kitchens. Crowds pressed forward, their laughter echoing beneath the archways. Men in fine robes carried polished plates that caught the sun like mirrors. Women draped in silks bore dishes engraved with family crests. Even farmers had scrubbed their copper bowls until they gleamed like gold. The air buzzed with excitement, for all knew this was no ordinary summons. The king himself had declared that each household must appear, each with its own plate, to share in a banquet that would be remembered for generations. As they entered the grand courtyard, guards inspected every guest. Each plate was lifted, examined, and set aside on long tables where the feast would later be served. The nobles puffed their chests with pride, showing off jeweled platters encrusted with rubies, carved ivory bowls passed down for centuries. Every glint of gold was a silent boast of wealth and lineage. And then came Lala. She shuffled through the line, her head bowed, her scar catching the light. In her hands she clutched the dented tin plate her aunt had thrust upon her. Its cracked edge wobbled as she held it out. The guard raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching as though he fought a laugh. "This is your family's plate?" he asked, holding it up for all to see. "Yes," she whispered, her voice nearly swallowed by the crowd. A ripple of laughter spread through the line. Nobles snickered, servants smirked, even villagers turned their heads to whisper. A cracked plate, fit for stray dogs. Does her house have no shame? Look at her face and now her plate. Both ruined. The guard set the plate aside with a shrug, but the mockery clung to Lala as she stepped forward. She could feel eyes burning holes into her back, hear the laughter ringing in her ears long after it had stopped. Inside the banquet hall, splendor exploded around her. Crystal chandeliers blazed with 100 candles, scattering light across marble floors polished until they gleamed like water. Along the walls stretched endless tables heavy with food, roasted lamb glazed with pomegranate, jeweled rice piled high with almonds and raisins, honey-dipped fruits gleaming like amber. Musicians played from balconies, their strings and flutes weaving through the air like silk. Families entered in procession, their finest garments sweeping across the floor. Gold bangles jingled, silk rustled, voices rose in admiration as each noble house was announced. Then came Lala. She slipped in quietly, unnoticed at first, until one woman gasped. Heads turned, eyes fixed on the scar that traced her cheek. Her rags hung loosely on her thin frame, patched and frayed. The laughter began softly, then swelled like a wave. Who let the beggar in? Is this a festival or a market for outcasts? Her plate is cracked, her face is cracked. How fitting. Heat rose in Lala's face. She wanted to disappear into the marble, to hide among the shadows. But there was nowhere to go. She was part of her aunt's household, and by decree she had to stand among them. Her cousins, draped in finery, moved 2 steps away, pretending not to know her. The feast began with ceremony. Heralds struck gongs and servants poured wine into golden goblets. The king entered, a figure of quiet majesty, his robe of deep blue trimmed with silver, a crown resting lightly on his brow. He raised his hand, and the hall fell into reverent silence. "Tonight," the king declared, his voice steady and commanding, "we break bread as one people. Noble and humble, rich and poor, all gathered in one hall. For it is not wealth alone that makes a kingdom strong, it is the spirit of its people." Applause filled the chamber, but Lala could not join. She stood at the far end of the line, her cracked plate burning in her thoughts, her scar a brand beneath every torchlight. Food was served and laughter returned. Plates gleamed as they were filled, saffron rice, roasted quail, pistachio-studded sweets. Servants bustled, nobles boasted, musicians played louder. Yet through it all Lala's heart sank deeper. Every glance felt like a dagger, every giggle like salt in her wound. At one point, a young noblewoman leaned close to her companion, loud enough for Lala to hear. If the king wishes monsters to serve him, here is his first choice. The hall erupted with stifled chuckles. Lala clenched her hands until her nails dug into her palms. She wanted to flee, but duty held her rooted. Her aunt had sent her here to be shamed, and she was living her cruelty step by step. Yet even as her shame deepened, she remembered her father's words, spoken long ago beneath the glow of the hearth. Do not let the world tell you your worth, little star. That is for the heavens alone to decide. She drew a quiet breath and lifted her head, not proudly, not defiantly, but with the faint dignity of one who refuses to be crushed. Still, the hall saw only her scar, her rags, her cracked plate. What none of them knew, what even Lala herself did not yet know, was that the night's humiliation was only the shadow before dawn. The king had not called his people together merely to feast. A test awaited, one that would turn mockery into astonishment and shame into revelation. And when his eyes swept the hall, they did not linger on jeweled plates or silken robes. They paused, if only for a moment, on the quiet girl in rags, holding her cracked dish as if it were the last fragile piece of herself she could not surrender. The hall buzzed with noise, clinking goblets, the rustle of silks, the chatter of nobles boasting about their jeweled plates and rare dishes. But suddenly a sound cut through it all, the steady strike of a staff on marble. The herald's voice rose, strong and clear. Silence in the presence of his majesty. The king shall now make his choice. The music died. The laughter faded. All eyes turned toward the dais where the king sat, his posture calm, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. His crown caught the firelight, but it was his eyes, keen, unflinching, that commanded the room. He rose slowly, and with a single motion of his hand, the servants began collecting the plates. One by one they lifted trays from each family, carrying them toward the dais. Golden dishes set with emeralds. Silver bowls with intricate carvings. Crystal platters that gleamed like ice. The nobles leaned forward, proud, certain the king would choose from among their treasures. Surely he will take mine, one whispered. The jewels alone are worth a fortune. Another chuckled softly. The king values heritage. My family's plate is centuries old. The king moved among them, inspecting each offering. His hand brushed the rim of a golden platter, then passed it by. He studied a silver bowl, then set it aside. He lifted a crystal dish, examined it in the light, then shook his head. One by one the most dazzling plates in the hall were rejected. Murmurs spread through the crowd, confusion rippling like wind through grass. What is he doing? Why reject such wealth? Does none please him? Lala stood at the far edge of the hall, clutching her cracked plate against her chest. She had not placed it with the others, her shame had been too heavy. Now she wished she could vanish entirely, become nothing more than shadow against the wall. And then the king's eyes swept across the hall. Past the nobles, past the jewels, past the embroidered silks. His gaze paused on her. Lala froze, her breath catching. The king lifted his hand and pointed. You, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. Bring me her plate. A hush fell, so deep the sound of a dropped goblet rang like thunder. Heads turned, mouths fell open. Her plate? Someone whispered in disbelief. The cracked one? A guard stepped forward, approaching Lala. She hesitated, heart hammering. Your Majesty, surely, she began, but the guard held out his hand. She had no choice. With trembling fingers she placed the broken dish into his grip. He carried it to the dais, setting it before the king as though it were fine porcelain. The king lifted it carefully, turning it in his hands. The crack ran jagged across the rim, a scar that mirrored the one on Lala's face. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied it in the firelight. Then slowly he smiled. This, he said, his voice calm but unshakable, is the plate I choose. Gasps erupted from the hall. A noble shouted, But sire, that plate is unworthy, broken, cheap, without beauty. Another cried, It is an insult to your table, Majesty. The king raised his hand and silence fell again. His gaze swept the hall, sharp as a blade. You think I seek gold? Jewels? Trinkets to dazzle the eye? His voice grew stronger, resonant, carrying to every corner. I seek what endures. I seek humility, dignity, and truth. What worth is a plate that shines on the outside but holds nothing within? Better the cracked dish that has known hardship than the gilded one that has never tasted struggle. His words struck the room like a storm. The nobles lowered their eyes, some in shame, some in resentment. The king set the plate before him, his hands steady. Then he spoke again, softer this time, yet no less commanding. This plate comes from the hand of one who has known humiliation, yet still carries herself with quiet strength. That is what I honor tonight. That is what I will dine from. The hall erupted in murmurs, shock swirling like wind through dry leaves. Lala stood frozen, her scar burning under 100 stares, but for the first time, it was not shame she felt. It was disbelief. Disbelief that the king himself had lifted her brokenness into the light. The king gestured to the herald. Announce it. The herald struck the staff again. By the will of his majesty, the chosen plate of the royal feast shall be the cracked dish carried by the maiden Lala. Her name rolled through the hall, carried by voices in astonishment. Lala's cousin stiffened in fury, her aunt's face drained of color. But the girl who had walked in as a shadow now stood in the blaze of torches, her broken plate transformed into a symbol of honor. The king leaned forward, his eyes resting on her once more. And though he said nothing more, the look he gave her carried a weight deeper than words. I have seen you. I know what others mocked and I call it worthy. For the first time in years, Lala lifted her head fully, meeting the king's gaze without lowering her eyes. Her scar caught the firelight, no longer a mark of shame but a badge of survival. And as the hall looked on in stunned silence, the girl they had scorned stood quietly, her spirit unbroken, her dignity restored. The hall seemed to tremble under the weight of silence. Nobles who once laughed now gawked, their jeweled goblets frozen in midair. The servants who had pitied Lala held their breath. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, strings and pipes hanging silent, waiting. The king stood tall on the dais, the cracked plate in his hands, his voice ringing like a bell through the chamber. You wonder why I have chosen this dish. You whisper, you scoff, you think me mad. But tonight you will learn why. He set the plate down gently on the table before him, and his gaze swept the crowd. I have seen enough of glitter and gold. Every noble here cloaks themselves in silk, flaunts their treasures, and yet hides their true faces. But beauty without truth is no beauty at all. Strength without humility is only weakness disguised. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, but none dared to interrupt. The king paused, then motioned toward Lala. Come forward. Her heart pounded as she stepped through the parting crowd. Their stares burned hotter than any flame, but she walked with quiet steps until she stood before the throne. Her hands trembled, but she did not bow her head. Not this time. The king regarded her with a steady gaze. What is your name? Her voice cracked at first, then steadied. Lala, your majesty. Lala. He spoke her name as though tasting it. Do you know why I chose your plate? She shook her head. No, my king. It is broken, unworthy. A small smile touched his lips. So too the world has called you unworthy. But I tell you this, brokenness does not strip away worth. Sometimes it reveals it. Murmurs rippled through the hall, but the king raised his hand, silencing them. His gaze softened as it rested on her scar. You bear a mark that others mock. But I see it for what it is. Not a curse. Not a flaw. A truth. Lala froze, the blood rushing in her ears. A truth? She whispered. The king nodded. Years ago, one of my guards reported to me what he saw. A maiden forced to eat from the floor, yet she carried herself with dignity even in humiliation. He told me of her silence, her tears swallowed, her spirit unbroken. That report never left my mind. Tonight, I see her with my own eyes. A gasp rose from the crowd. Many realized then that the scarred girl mocked for years was the very one the king himself had quietly known of all along. But the king was not finished. He turned to the plate, lifted it high, and spoke once more. This dish is cracked, yet it still holds food. It bears scars, yet it has not lost its purpose. So too with this woman. She has been wounded, yet she remains whole. And what's more, her scar is no ordinary mark. The hall leaned forward, every ear straining. The king gestured to one of his scholars who approached with a torch. He nodded toward Lala. Step into the light. Confused, she obeyed, and the scholar raised the flame close to her face. Gasps echoed through the hall. For as the firelight touched her scar, the jagged mark glimmered faintly, as though tiny threads of silver had been etched into her skin. What sorcery is this? A noblewoman cried. The king's voice cut her short. It is no sorcery. It is heritage. This mark is one I have seen before, in portraits of our kingdom's earliest queens. A line said to carry grace not in ornament but in endurance. Burned by fire, revealed by flame. Shock coursed through the hall like lightning. Lala herself staggered back, her hand rising to her cheek. My scar? She whispered. Yes, the king said, his voice steady. The blood of queens flows in your veins, though cruelty sought to hide it. Your scar is not disfigurement, it is revelation. Proof of your lineage, proof of your strength. What others mocked, destiny preserved. The hall erupted in cries of disbelief, awe, and envy. Her cousins paled, her aunt nearly collapsed where she stood. For years they had tried to bury her, but her scar had carried the very key to her truth. The king raised his hand again and silence fell once more. He looked not at the nobles but at Lala, his words carrying only to her heart. The world burned you to erase you. Instead, it revealed who you are meant to be. Tears stung her eyes but she held them back. She could not weep now, not before those who had shamed her. Instead, she stood taller, her scar gleaming in the torchlight, no longer a wound but a crown. The king turned to his people. Let all know this, beauty is not in smoothness of skin or perfection of form. Beauty is truth, courage, and dignity carried through fire. From this day forward, let none mock her scar, for it is a mark of honor. The hall bowed in silence, some reluctantly, some in awe. Lala stood at the center, her cracked plate now resting beside the king's throne, her scar shining with secret heritage. And for the first time in her life she felt not broken, not ashamed, but seen, known, and unshakably whole. The hall was still humming with shock when a sharp cry split through the air. Lies. Every head turned toward the voice. It was Lala's stepmother, her hands trembling as she pushed past the stunned nobles, her face blotched with fury. Her silks were disheveled, her jewels slipping loose, but she did not care. Rage burned brighter than dignity. She bewitched you, Majesty, she shrieked, pointing at Lala with a trembling finger. This scar, this trick of the light, it is witchcraft. She has deceived us all with her foul sorcery. The crowd gasped. Some murmured in doubt, others in curiosity. But the king did not flinch. He simply regarded her with a calm, piercing gaze. Witchcraft. Yes, she cried, her voice rising to a fevered pitch. This wretched girl has long dabbled in secret arts. Why else would fire not consume her? Why else would her scar glimmer like silver? It is unnatural, it is cursed. She should be cast out, no, burned again until the spell is broken. Her words rang shrill in the vaulted hall, but they carried no weight. Instead, they reeked of desperation. The nobles who once whispered against Lala now whispered against the stepmother. Look how wild she is. Her fear betrays her. She cannot stand that the girl has risen. The king raised his hand and silence followed like a tide. His voice was low yet it struck like iron. I have heard enough. He stepped down from the dais, his crown gleaming under the torchlight, and faced the trembling woman. You speak of witchcraft but I see only cruelty. You speak of curses but I see envy, festering in your heart until it has rotted into malice. The stepmother staggered, her lips parting but no words came. The king's eyes narrowed. 4 years you reduced this girl to ashes. You stripped her of honor, starved her, mocked her, scarred her. And now, when truth lifts her up, you claw to drag her down again. Enough. This kingdom will not be ruled by cruelty, nor poisoned by lies. He turned to his guards. Take her. Gasps broke out as armored men stepped forward. The stepmother screamed, thrashing in their grip. No. No, you cannot do this to me. I am noble, I am respected. She is nothing. She is nothing. But her words fell into emptiness. The guards dragged her back through the hall, her cries echoing off the stone, growing smaller until they vanished into the corridors beyond. A heavy silence remained. Some nobles shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their eyes. For all their power, they had seen what became of cruelty unmasked before a king who valued truth. Lala stood frozen, her heart pounding. For so long she had endured her stepmother's scorn in silence, never daring to hope for justice. Now, before the eyes of the kingdom, that justice had come, not by her hand, but by a power greater than cruelty could withstand. The king returned to his throne, his expression calm once more. Let all who witnessed remember this night, he declared. Those who wound the innocent will face their judgment. Those who rise from fire with dignity will find their honor. And as his words settled over the hall, Lala's stepmother's fury was remembered not as strength, but as the final desperate cry of a tyrant undone. When the hall quieted again, all eyes turned once more to Lala. She stood as if in a dream, the echoes of her stepmother's cries still haunting her ears. For years that voice had been her prison bars, her torment in every hour. Now it was gone, dragged away, silenced by the king himself. But what now? The king rose from his throne and descended the dais, the cracked plate still resting upon the table like a witness. His robes swept across the marble floor as he came to stand before her. His eyes held neither pity nor command, only the quiet weight of choice. "Lala," he said, his voice gentle yet unshakable, "you have carried fire, humiliation, and cruelty without letting them destroy your spirit. Tonight your truth has been revealed. The palace doors stand open to you. If you wish it, you may dwell here, honored, free from the chains that once bound you." Gasps stirred among the nobles. To offer a scarred servant girl a place in the palace? It was unheard of. Yet none dared to speak against it. They had seen the scar shine. They had seen the king's judgment. Lala bowed her head, not in shame but in thought. The offer was more than she had ever dared to imagine. Warmth, safety, respect, all within reach. Yet as she stood before the king, she knew that her heart longed not for gilded walls, but for something deeper. She lifted her gaze steady now. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I am grateful beyond words. But I ask not for riches, nor to sit above others. What I desire is simple, the freedom to live with dignity. To no longer be bound by cruelty, to no longer bow to those who sought to break me. Let me serve in honesty, live in peace, and walk in the world as myself." The king's eyes shone, and for a moment, the hall seemed to still as though holding its breath. Then he nodded. "So it shall be. You shall never again serve under cruelty. You shall live in freedom, not as a prisoner of pity, but as one honored for her truth." He turned to the court. "Mark this, mercy is not weakness. Forgiveness is not folly. But forgiveness does not bind one again to chains. Tonight she forgives, but she does not return to her torment. That is strength greater than vengeance." Lala's cousins looked away, their faces pale with shame. They had mocked her for years, yet she did not turn to mock them now. She simply let them fade into silence, for her heart was no longer tethered to their cruelty. The king gestured to the herald, who struck the staff and proclaimed, "By the will of his majesty, the maiden Lala shall be honored guest of the palace. She shall walk in freedom, guarded by the crown's protection. Her scar, once mocked, shall be remembered as a mark of truth and endurance." Cheers rose, not from the nobles at first, but from the servants who had long pitied her, who had seen her toil in shadows. Their voices swelled, rising above the jeweled silence of the court, until even the nobles joined in, unwilling to resist the tide. Lala stood in the center of it all, her scar gleaming faintly in the torchlight, her heart at last unbound. She had not sought power, yet dignity had found her. She had not sought revenge, yet justice had arrived. She had chosen forgiveness but not chains. For the first time since fire had touched her skin, she felt the heat lift, not burning, not branding but warming, as though the very flame that had once scarred her now lit her path forward. The palace doors were open, yes. But more than that, her spirit was open, free, untethered from the shadows of cruelty. Her fate had been transformed, not by pity, not by wealth, but by truth. And as the king returned to his throne, he left the cracked plate where all could see it. A reminder that brokenness could still serve its purpose. A reminder that scars could carry crowns. Years passed, but the night of the cracked plate was never forgotten. In the palace treasury, among jewels and relics of conquest, there rested an object more humble than them all, the broken dish once clutched by a scarred maiden. Visitors came from distant lands to marvel not at the gold crowns or emerald scepters, but at that simple plate, cracked across its rim. For beside it, engraved on a plaque of bronze, were the words the king had spoken that night: "Better the vessel scarred by fire yet still whole, than the vessel gilded with gold yet hollow within." Lala herself lived quietly, not as a queen nor as a courtly ornament, but as something rarer, a woman free. She chose to remain close to the palace, serving not as a noble, but as a counselor of compassion. When disputes arose among the people, it was often to her that the king turned, for she carried the wisdom of suffering transformed into strength. She forgave her cousins in time, though she did not walk again beneath their roof. They lived with the memory of their cruelty, which weighed heavier on them than any punishment could. And though whispers of jealousy still lingered, none dared mock her scar again. For in the torchlight, that scar gleamed faintly, like a line of silver against her skin, a mark not of shame but of survival, not of weakness but of truth. Mothers told their daughters, "Do not fear your scars, for they may be the crown you do not yet see." Fathers told their sons, "Respect the broken, for they may carry strength you cannot imagine." The people of the kingdom began to measure beauty differently. No longer only by smooth skin or perfect form, but by the endurance of spirit, the grace in hardship, the dignity that shines through pain. And though the nobles still flaunted their jewels, they found themselves glancing now and then toward the cracked plate in the treasury, reminded that even gold could not outweigh truth. As for the king, he lived long, and his reign was remembered not only for his conquests or his decrees, but for the night he chose a scarred maiden's plate above all the wealth of his kingdom. "A ruler's greatness," he once said, "is not measured by the crowns he wears, but by the dignity he uplifts." And when travelers asked of Lala's story, the villagers told it with reverence. They spoke of a girl once forced to eat from the floor, mocked and beaten, yet who carried herself with quiet strength. They spoke of the fire that scarred her face, and how that scar revealed her hidden lineage and unbreakable spirit. They spoke of a king who saw truth where others saw only shame, and who raised her from ashes to honor. But most of all, they spoke of the legacy left behind, that dignity, once restored, shines brighter than jewels, and that scars, though painful, can become the marks by which the world remembers us. In the final years of her life, when her hair silvered and her hands grew thin, Lala often visited the treasury in silence. She would stand before the cracked plate, tracing its broken rim with her finger, and smile faintly. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was grand, but because it had been like her, broken, cast aside, mocked. And yet, like her, it had been chosen, honored, remembered. One evening, as the sun set over the palace walls, a child asked her, "Lady Lale, does the scar on your face still hurt?" She bent down, her eyes kind, her voice soft. "Once it did. But now it is not a wound. It is a story." And with that, she walked on, her shadow stretching long across the stone, carrying not shame, but the quiet, unshakable grace of one who had turned her scar into light. And so, her tale lived on, not just in the halls of the palace, nor in the whispers of the nobles, but in the very hearts of the people. For generations, the scarred maiden's story became a beacon, a reminder that true worth is not measured in unbroken perfection, but in the courage to rise, even from the fire.